They called it the
February
storm of the century.
1978.
When it finally
One of the
abated,
worst
world they
winter
knew
storms
was
in
gone,
decades was
buried under
tearing
feet of
across
snow
northern
and ice.
Ohio. Roads disappeared beneath snow, power lines collapsed, stores closed early, and thousands of families wondered how long they could wait for things to return to normal. But on a small Amish farm outside Holmes County, 76-year-old Sarah Yoder was kneading bread as though nothing unusual was happening. One of her grandsons stood by the window, watching the wind shake the trees. Finally, he asked the question everyone else was thinking. "Grandma, aren't you worried?" Sarah smiled, not because she ignored the storm, and not because life had always been easy. She smiled because she had seen difficult winters before. Then she quietly answered, "The winter isn't the problem. The problem is forgetting that it always comes."
Rapidly. Do
Her
not
grandson
attempt to travel.
didn't understand.
Stay tuned for updates
Not
on the
yet.
hour.
But the answer to that question
winter
had
isn't
begun
the
45
problem.
years earlier, back when Sarah was 8 years old, back when she hated apples.
More stew
Most
for you,
people
Father.
think the Amish survived hard
good and
times
hearty,
because they
Mother.
lived simple lives.
Did the boys
But
finish the
simple
milking?
living never fed a family. What carried generations through harsh winters, poor harvests, and difficult years was something much quieter. Knowledge. Lessons passed from parents to children. And sometimes, those lessons came disguised as
North
ordinary
field is ready
food.
for the planting,
Tonight, we're
Good.
counting down
We will
13
start in the
forgotten Amish foods that helped real families survive hard times. But these stories aren't
not
really
fair.
about food.
There's
They're
enough for
about mothers,
everyone.
fathers,
Welcome home, honey.
neighbors, and the people who quietly made sure no one went to bed hungry. And by the end, you understand why Sarah Yoder never feared the storm of 1978. 1. Apple butter. In 1933, 8-year-old Sarah hated apple season. While other children played outside, she spent hours peeling apples beside her mother. Her fingers became sticky, her arms hurt, and she couldn't understand why anyone needed so many jars. One afternoon, she finally asked, "Why do we have to make so much?"
How long does it take
Her
for
mother
the
smiled
apples to
while
turn
stirring
into
the
butter?
giant kettle. Because January doesn't care if we are tired. At the time, Sarah thought adults said strange things. But when winter arrived and snow covered the fields, she watched her mother open one of those jars and spread apple butter over fresh bread while her father warmed himself beside the stove. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Inside, nobody worried. And many years later, Sarah realized her mother hadn't been preparing apples. She had been preparing peace. 2. Cornmeal mush. If there was one thing Sarah disliked even more than peeling apples, it was cornmeal
I can't believe
mush.
you guys dragged me out
Every
here. It's
cold
freezing,
morning,
and I'm
the
pretty sure I
same
saw a
pot
draft.
sat
Look at her,
waiting
she's
beside the
actually
stove. She complained. Her
not that
brothers
bad,
complained. And her father always laughed. "Someday you'll miss this." Everyone laughed, including Sarah. Years
Remember that
passed,
Christmas back in
parents grew
72?
older,
Oh, how
children
could I
moved
forget?
away,
You spilled the
and one
gravy
Christmas,
everywhere.
long after their mother was
mother
gone,
blamed me for it.
Sarah's
Your mother,
oldest brother
she always
smiled
said this
and said,
coffee tasted
"When I
best
was
when
10,
shared with
I
the ones
prayed
you
I'd
love.
never eat cornmeal mush
I miss her
again."
every day.
Everyone laughed. Then he looked down at his coffee. "And now I'd give anything to have breakfast with Mom one more time."
Then he said, "That's not
Suddenly,
my
no
raccoon."
one was thinking
I tell
about
you, that
food.
fella
They
always
were
had a way with
remembering home.
words.
Careful now.
Before we continue, I'd love to know something. Was there a food your parents or grandparents used to make that instantly brings back memories? Tell us in the comments. Because sometimes the most ordinary meals become the memories we treasure most. 3. Bean soup. By 22, Sarah was married and expecting her first child. Then came a poor harvest. Nothing disastrous, but enough to make a young couple worry. One night, after her husband went outside to check the animals, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen and quietly cried. She wondered if she would be able to care for the family she was bringing into the world. When her husband came back inside, he sat beside her and squeezed her hand. "We have enough." The next evening, she made bean soup. Simple ingredients, simple meal. But somehow, as steam rose from the pot, the fear began to disappear. And by spring, Sarah had learned something no one had ever taught her. Sometimes, courage looks like making supper. 4. Sauerkraut. Every autumn, Sarah's mother filled crocks with cabbage. As a child, Sarah thought the smell was terrible. But one snowy evening, while serving sauerkraut beside potatoes and bread, her mother smiled and said, "We aren't eating cabbage tonight. We're eating summer." Sarah laughed. She didn't understand until years later, when she realized her mother had never trusted luck. She trusted preparation. 5. Scrapple. By the early 1950s, Sarah had children running through the house and enough responsibilities to understand why her parents never wasted anything. Then one spring storm changed everything. Strong winds tore through the area and badly damaged a neighbor's barn. No one waited for insurance. No one talked about money. At sunrise the next morning, wagons and buggies began arriving. Men brought tools, women brought food, teenagers carried lumber, even children found ways to help. Sarah spent most of the day in the kitchen with other women, preparing bread, coffee, and scrapple. It wasn't fancy. In fact, outsiders often found it strange. But the older generation saw it differently. Scrapple represented something important. Respect. Respect for the animal. Respect for hard work. And gratitude for anything God provided. As the smell of coffee and fresh bread filled the room, Sarah watched neighbors laughing together while the sounds of hammers echoed outside. By sunset, the damaged barn was standing again. Years later, Sarah rarely spoke about the storm, but she never forgot the people, because difficult times had taught her something beautiful. No family survives alone. 6. Pickled eggs. As the children grew older, life settled into familiar routines. Before sunrise, Sarah's husband was already outside. Soon, boys were old enough to join him. And every morning, before they left, Sarah packed lunch. Fresh bread, a few vegetables, and always a couple of pickled eggs. The jars sat quietly on the pantry shelves. Nothing special, nothing expensive, but dependable. Years later, her oldest son remembered something strange. He couldn't remember most of the meals, but he remembered his mother standing by the kitchen table before dawn. He remembered the smell of bread. He remembered his father's boots near the door, and he remembered those glass jars, always waiting. As a boy, he barely noticed them. As a man, he finally understood. His mother had already thought about tomorrow before today was finished. And somehow, no matter how tight money became, there was always food, always warmth, always peace waiting inside the house. 7. Potato soup. One winter, when Sarah's youngest son was 9 years old, he became seriously ill. Snow covered the roads. Travel was difficult, and the nearest doctor couldn't arrive until morning. Sarah spent the entire night beside his bed. Every hour she checked his temperature. Every hour she prayed. And whenever the boy woke up, she returned to the kitchen and reheated potato soup. Just enough to keep him eating. Just enough to keep his strength. Near sunrise, his fever finally began to break. Years later, that same boy became a grandfather himself. And while telling stories to his grandchildren, he smiled and said, "I don't remember much about being sick, but I remember Mom sitting beside me, and I remember the smell of potato soup." Sometimes memories attach themselves to strange things, not because of the food, but because of the love surrounding it. 8. Dried apples. By the late 1960s, Sarah had become a grandmother. And strangely enough, memories seemed to visit her more often, usually in autumn, usually when apples were hanging to dry. No matter how old she became, that smell always brought her back to childhood. Back to her mother's kitchen, back to the old stove, back to the sound of laughter. One afternoon, while hanging apples to dry with one of her daughters, Sarah suddenly stopped and smiled. "What is it?" her daughter asked. Sarah laughed softly. "I just heard my mother."
Mama always said the best apples
There was no
were the
voice,
ones you dried yourself.
no sound, only
brings
memory.
me back to her kitchen every time.
Years later,
I still remember
that same
when you
daughter
used to
would say,
sneak these right off the
whenever I
counter.
smell apples drying, I think
And
of
you
Mom.
used to pretend you didn't see
Not
me.
recipes, not food. Mom. And although Sarah didn't know it yet, another winter was coming. A winter that would remind her why her mother had spent so many years preparing for things nobody wanted to think about.
So the harvest
9.
looks good this
Lard
year.
bread.
Gott sei Dank. We'll have
By the
enough to
early
last the winter.
And the
1970s,
children
life
are
had
certainly
become
enjoying the
quieter.
afternoon.
Some of Sarah's children were married. Grandchildren had begun filling the house on Sundays. And although the world around her seemed to move faster every year, certain things never changed. The smell of bread, the old clock above the doorway,
Why do you spread it so carefully,
and the sound
Grandpa?
of her husband's
Because
boots
good
coming through the
bread
kitchen
deserves
after a long
patience,
day.
son.
As a little girl, Sarah never understood why her father seemed happiest sitting in silence with nothing more than warm bread and coffee. Years later, she understood. Hard work changes the way people think about food, and gratitude changes the way
Pass the
they
bread,
enjoy it.
please.
Oh, look
One
at
evening,
those two.
her
They are
grandson
always
watched his
laughing.
grandfather spread butter across
remember
thick
when you
slices of
used to
fresh
do that.
lard bread and
There
asked,
was a time when
Grandpa,
hunger was a
why do you
daily
always
companion?"
smile when Grandpa bakes bread? The old man chuckled. When I was young, I learned something. Hunger doesn't care about fancy meals. It only cares whether there's enough. The boy nodded, though Sarah knew he didn't fully understand.
Adios,
Not yet.
abuela. We'll see you
Because
next
some
week.
lessons arrive
Drive
only
safe,
after
mijo.
enough winters.
The road is dark.
10.
It is a peaceful
Molasses.
night.
Money was tight
Let
during
us
many Christmas
remember
seasons
the true
when Sarah was growing
meaning
up. But somehow, her mother always found a way to make the holidays feel magical. One year, when Sarah was 12, there were very few gifts under the tree. No one complained, because after supper, her mother
That
brought
molasses
fresh
bread is
bread
hitting
to
the
the
spot,
table
isn't it?
and spread
It's so warm,
molasses
I
over
love it.
each warm slice.
Here, have another slice.
To a child, it tasted
Just
like
we do
Christmas.
every year.
Years
It
later,
smells
Sarah
so
laughed
good,
when she
Mom.
remembered how excited
finally
everyone
have some hot
became over
chocolate?
something so simple. And after she became a mother herself, she found herself repeating the same tradition. One snowy evening, she watched her youngest daughter smile with the exact same excitement she once had. And for a brief moment, Sarah saw her own
I
mother
realized
again. Not in a picture,
happiness really
not in a
doesn't
memory,
need much room
but in a
at all.
simple gesture. Years passed, grandchildren arrived, and one afternoon, one of them asked, Grandma, why does your house feel different?
telling you, it was the best
Sarah
Christmas
looked around
ever.
the kitchen. Steam rose
Remember
from
when
coffee
Grandpa
cups.
dressed up as Santa?
Bread cooled beside the stove.
There we are.
Snow
Careful
drifted
now,
past
it's
the
very
windows.
warm.
And she smiled.
It smells wonderful,
Because happiness
Mama.
doesn't
Thank
need
you.
much womb. The child laughed, but someday he would remember. And by then, another winter would arrive. One unlike any Sarah had seen before. 11.
The
Root
blizzard of
cellar.
78, as
February
it came to be known,
1978.
was unprecedented.
The storm had
Holmes
become
County was
worse.
completely
Roads were buried. Electricity had failed across entire communities. People listened to the radio and wondered
What
how
happens if
long
the
supplies
stores
would
don't open?
last. Inside the Yoder home, grandchildren sat close to the stove. The younger children sensed the worry in the adults. And finally, one of them asked, Grandma, what if the stores don't open? Sarah smiled. Not because she had all the answers, but because she remembered another winter, another kitchen, another woman, her mother. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and reached for the lantern hanging beside the door. Slowly, she descended the old wooden steps leading beneath the house.
Mama, what
The
is in
cool
this
smell of
jar?
earth rose
Those are
around
your
her.
grandmother's famous
Bowls
pickles,
of
Sarah.
jars lined
We'll
the shelves.
open them for the festival.
Potatoes, carrots, onions, dried apples. Everything. 12. Shoofly Pie. Later that evening, with the wind still shaking the windows, Sarah began making shoofly
Grandma,
pie.
why do you always make
One of
the
her
same
grandsons
things?
watched her work.
Because these are the recipes
Grandma,
your
why do you
grandfather
always
loved
make the
most.
same things? Sarah stopped for a moment and looked out the window. Snow swirled through the darkness. And suddenly, she wasn't 76 anymore. She was 8, standing beside her own mother, listening to the same winter wind, smelling the same pie. Life had changed. America had changed. But
Here's a
somehow,
warm slice,
the kitchen
sweetie.
felt exactly
Thank
the
you,
same.
Grandma.
She smiled and handed the boy a piece. Because some things deserve to stay. The boy didn't fully understand. Not then.
This sweet potato
But someday,
pie is
long after she was
incredible,
gone,
Grandpa. It sure
The smell
is
of
cozy
molasses
in here
and
with
warm
all that
pie
snow
would bring him
outside.
back to this very
The
moment.
trick is in the crumbs, Sarah.
And
Make
before
sure
the
they're
storm
just
ended,
right.
Sarah would teach him one final lesson. The same lesson her own mother had taught her decades before. 13. The pantry that never went empty. The storm continued through the night. Snow piled against the windows. The wind rattled the house. And the radio brought little comfort. Across Ohio, families
blizzard
worried
warning remains
about
in effect
roads,
until tomorrow
power,
evening.
and
We
supplies.
anticipate significant
But
snowfall and
inside the
icy
Yoder
conditions
home,
across the state.
something
Stay
remarkable
tuned for
happened.
updates.
Life slowed
Are
down.
you scared, Sarah?
The grandchildren played
No,
quietly
honey.
on the floor.
I'm not scared.
Coffee simmered on the stove. The smell of shoofly pie still lingered in the kitchen. And although everyone knew the storm outside was serious, nobody panicked. Not because they ignored reality, but because Sarah had spent her entire life preparing for moments like this. As supper finished, one of the younger grandchildren
The winter
looked up
is not
and
the
asked the
problem.
question that had been living inside everyone's mind. Grandma, aren't you scared? Sarah sat quietly for a moment. Then she smiled. Not the smile of someone who had never suffered, but the smile of someone who had survived enough winters to know that fear solved very little. She looked toward the dark window where snow swirled through the night, and suddenly she remembered her mother. She remembered the Great Depression. She remembered nearly 20 years after
mine.
Sarah
Give
was
it back.
gone. One of
Come
her
and get it.
great-granddaughters stood inside that same kitchen on a snowy Sunday afternoon.
slow down.
Children ran through the house.
have so much
Coffee
energy this
brewed
morning.
on the stove. Fresh bread
smells
cooled
wonderful
beside
in
the
here.
window. And while searching through an old drawer, she found a yellowed piece of paper. The handwriting was faded, but she recognized the name immediately. Sarah Yoder. She smiled. Outside, snow drifted across the fields.
You remind me a
Inside,
lot of
4
your
generations sat
great-grandmother,
around the
Sarah.
same table. And somewhere between the
wish I could
smell
have
of
met her.
bread and the sound of laughter, it almost felt as though Sarah had never really left. Because some people leave money, some leave land. Sarah left something harder to lose. She left home. Before you go, I'd love to ask you something. Was there a recipe, a meal, or a tradition that someone in your family passed down to you? Maybe it came from your mother, maybe your grandmother, or maybe it's something almost forgotten
That's
today.
it. Push it down like
I'd
this.
genuinely love to hear
Very
your
good.
story in the
I'm doing
comments.
it, Abuela.
Because
Yes, you
sometimes
are.
what feels
Now again.
ordinary to us becomes priceless to the generations that come after us. And maybe the next memory worth preserving is already sitting somewhere
Gently
inside
now,
your
push
own
it right
home,
to the edge.
waiting to be remembered.
You're doing
Thank you for
wonderful.
spending
Like
this
this,
time with
Grandma.
me. And until
Perfect, my
next
dear.
time, take care of yourself. And don't forget the things that deserve to be remembered. On winter evenings, when snow falls quietly across Holmes County and the lights inside the houses begin to glow, families
anyone?
still gather
The
around
children
kitchen
certainly are
tables,
enjoying
much like they did
themselves today.
generations ago.
Save some
Children
room for the
laugh,
pie later.
coffee brews, old recipes are taken from drawers and cupboards, and somewhere, perhaps without even realizing it, someone is repeating a lesson
And so the
taught
little
by a
Robin
mother,
finally
a father,
found his way
or a
home,
grandparent
tired but
many
happy.
years ago.
He realized then
Because wisdom
there truly
rarely arrives with fanfare. Most of the time, it arrives quietly, in the smell of bread, in a handwritten recipe, in a story told after supper. And perhaps that's why Sarah Yoder never really feared winter. Not because she believed storms wouldn't come, but because she knew something many people forget.
Hold it steady now, not too
Long
deep.
before
That's
grocery
right.
stores,
Is this
long
good?
before
Very
electricity,
good, Ephraim. Soon
long
you'll be
before
as fast
modern
as your father.
conveniences, there were ordinary people who learned how to care for one another. And somehow, through recipes, memories,
those
and
days,
traditions.
the stars
They
were so
still
bright
do.
you could almost touch them.
Maybe that's the
We didn't
real
have
reason
much,
those 13
but we had the
forgotten foods
stories.
mattered. Not because they saved lives, but because they reminded people that no one should face hard times alone. And perhaps that's the kind of wisdom worth passing on. Fade out.